Britain's private schools receive hundreds of millions of pounds in tax breaks from the government despite charging eye-watering fees. That's an arrangement that Labour has pledged to end, and the Tories hate it, none more so than Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. He was educated at Winchester College, an exclusive boys' school that charges nearly £35,000 a year for day pupils and £46,000 for boarders. That's people who live there during term. At Prime Minister's questions, Keir Starmer put this to the former head boy.
Mr. Speaker, Winchester College has a rowing club, a rifle club, an extensive art collection. They charge over £45,000 a year in fees. Why did he hand them nearly £6 million of taxpayers' money this year in what his Levelling Up Secretary calls egregious state support?
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased he wants to talk about schools because we recently announced billions more funding for our schools. We're helping millions of the most disadvantaged children catch up with their lost learning. And we're driving up school standards, Mr. Speaker. But during COVID, he wanted to keep schools closed. We shouldn't be surprised because I listen to parents and he listens to his union paymasters.
His Levelling Up Secretary, I see him down there, who, after all, was Education Secretary for 4 years, said you could scarcely find a better way of ending burning injustices than scrapping these handouts. And here's why, and he talks about driving up standards. Just down the road in Southampton, and he'll know this, 4 in every 10 pupils fail their English or Maths GCSE this year. 4 in 10. Is that £6 million of taxpayers' money better spent on rifle ranges in Winchester or driving up standards in Southampton?
He talks about school standards. It's under a Conservative government, and thanks to the reforms of the former Education Secretary, that now almost 90% of schools are good or outstanding. But Mr. Speaker, whenever he attacks me about where I went to school, he is attacking the hard-working aspiration of millions of people in this country. He's attacking people like my parents, Mr. Speaker. This is a country that believes in opportunity, not resentment. He doesn't understand that, and that's why he's not fit to lead.
7% of students go to private school, don't they? So that's Rishi Sunak essentially saying, if you're one of the other 93%, you're not particularly aspirational. The aspirational thing to do is to send your kids to private school, because if you had aspiration, you wouldn't send them to the state schools that the Tories have been underfunding for 12 years. Let's move on to the reference the reference to the Levelling Up Minister, Michael Gove. So in 2017, when the former Education Secretary was a backbencher, that was under Theresa May, he wrote an article in The Times with this headline. You might be surprised to see Michael Gove writing this. Put VAT on school fees and soak the rich. And you got this subheading, removing the tax advantages of private schools would boost standards in the state sector and raise vital extra funds. Now, obviously, he is now in cabinet, so he is agreeing with what Keir Starmer was saying there. Let's go on to the article. So in the piece, he said this: private school fees are VAT exempt. That tax advantage allows the wealthiest in this country, indeed the very wealthiest in the globe, to buy a prestige service that secures their children a permanent positional edge in society at an effective 20% discount. Private schools and their students are massively overrepresented in the highest ranks of politics, business, the media, and sport. They still secure a dominant share of the places at Russell Group universities, in our leading professions, and in our cultural firmament. Are the children of the rich intrinsically more talented and worthy, more gifted and more deserving of celebration than the rest? Of course not. But our state-subsidised private schools continue to give them every possible advantage. The money we raise from ending the tax advantages enjoyed by private schools could be redeployed to help the most vulnerable children of all those taken into care. We could increase the amount spent on their education through the pupil premium. We could expand Frontline, the scheme that recruits the most talented Russell Group graduates to become social workers, supporting these children. So that's sounding a hell of a lot more progressive than Rishi Sunak. Indeed, it's hard not to agree with Gove's former self there. I wonder what he was thinking when the cameras are on him at Prime Minister's question today. So what are the facts here? Because private schools are counted as charities. They don't charge VAT on their fees, but they also don't pay corporation tax or capital gains tax on their profits. And they get an 80% discount on business rates. That's even though many of them have huge endowments. For example, Sunak's old school Winchester has an endowment of £417 million, which is second only to Eton's £542 million. And any interest on dividends they earn on those sums are currently completely tax-free. In total, the tax exemptions enjoyed by private schools cost the Treasury £3 billion every year, and just forcing private schools to charge VAT on fees would raise £1.7 billion. Of course, that would also increase their fees by 20%, leading the Daily Mail to run this hysterical front page. Keir's class war threat to 200 private schools. And they say Labour plan to put VAT on fees could lead to mass closures. Now, first of all, 200 schools aren't going to close. The Mail and all the other papers who've picked up that line are very sketchy on the details, and most people who can afford those fees can afford an extra 20%. Well, that's what I assumed, but can they? Can they? Because not everyone agrees. This is how Nick Ferrari responded to Labour's plans.
Let me get this out there. I benefited from having a private education, but I recall that my parents, I'm not going to pretend for a second that we struggled or we didn't, but it was out there. And as you now know, I've told you the school that my two sons went to, and I was very lucky that my ex-wife, that was a decision we took, and they went to a great school in Dulwich called Allaines. But let me tell you, the idea that they are the preserve of rich people is, pardon my language, utter cobblers. I saw people bringing their children to that particular school with cars held together with gaffer tape, who didn't take, maybe just had one holiday a year, and that was very much a staycation, didn't have this amazing life of skiing. Now, are there children who go to these schools whose parents go skiing to Verbier and they have their own villas in Tuscany? Yes, of course there are. And is there a brand new Porsche and a Range Rover? Yes, of course there is. But there are also parents who decide that what they want to do with their money is work damn hard, save, and then not renew the car, not go on holiday, not have lovely fur coats or watches or whatever else, and we should allow the decision, shouldn't we?
First of all, I'm just going to preempt everything I say. I'm very rich. My parents were very rich. My children are incredibly privileged, and I was also incredibly privileged. But in my experience of being incredibly privileged, I have met the odd person who seemed not exactly completely rich. They had gaffer tape on their cars. Can you believe it? But they had parents that cared so much about their kids that they taped up their cars with gaffer tape so they could afford to give their children the best future. That's the aspiration that Rishi Sunak was talking about in PMQs. Inspiring, really, isn't it, Dahlia? Were you moved by Nick Ferrari's tales of parents rocking up to private school with gaffer tape on their cars, foregoing holidays abroad so that they can give their children the future they deserve?
It's just absolutely disgusting. Like, to even be able to make the choice between a second holiday and your child going to private school, or a fur coat and your child going to private school, that in itself indicates that you are in like the top percentiles of wealth in this country. If you're working a minimum wage job, or if you're working a job where you haven't had a real terms pay rise in years, you can't like aspire your way into like an extra 30k a year. Like, it's just, the maths isn't mathsing here. But on a broader point, I mean, there isn't any justification for the existence of private schools, let alone the idea that they should have tax exempt status from the government and be essentially subsidized by the government. Because the only logic that underpins the idea that a private school should exist is the logic that wealthier kids are entitled to a better start in life. Like, that's it. Why else would you create a two-tier education system that is based on money? It's actually not about aspiration at all. It's actually the opposite, because aspiration implies some kind of social mobility or class mobility. No, the existence of private schools is 100% about the preservation of class. It's about wealthy people, regardless of, ability or commitment to education or whatever. And, I'm not going to get into this idea of, I don't think that you can ascertain a person's ability or a child's ability at the age of 5 or at the age of 11, but whatever, like, put that to one side. The notion of a private school is that regardless of academic ability or commitment to education, that the children of the wealthy have their place in society secured. And, making the claim that, the odd lower middle class kid or the odd middle class kid managed to kind of slip their way in because their parents, gave everything up, or their parents worked 3 jobs. That is the exception that proves the rule, that this is about fundamentally preserving the class interest of the very wealthy. The idea that some lower middle class parents should give up everything and should work multiple jobs in order to give their child a solid start in life. And that's not to say that comprehensive schools can't give you solid starts in life, but it's very difficult with the kind of under-resourcing that we're seeing in the state education sector. But that's not a positive thing. It's not a positive idea that a parent feels like they have to take on multiple jobs that will take them away from other parts of parenthood, that they have to give up, important family experiences or whatever in order to give their child a solid start in life. That's not a good thing. Like, that's not something to be proud of. That is an indictment of a system that, stratifies children, at the beginning of their lives into the haves and the have-nots, into an education environment that has, good resources, that has the kinds of facilities that allow for children to develop their talents and develop their interests, that has special education needs provisions, that has, a decent child to teacher ratio. These are all things that we know impacts outcomes and is much more accessible for private schools. And the reason that people like Rishi Sunak and Nick Ferrari are so deeply attached to the private school system is because they deeply fear what it would mean to lose it. What would it mean to lose the choice that wealthy people have to ensure that their child is in the top 7% of educational outcomes? What would it mean for them to lose the ability to make that choice, to guarantee that role in society? Because in fact, for them, the disparity between comprehensively educated kids and privately educated kids works in their favor. If anything, it's a bonus because it widens the gap between their children and the rest of society. It gives their kid the competitive edge because it gives them a bunch of stuff that kids who have gone to state schools can't access. And, I even think that the whole idea that Labour is going down this revoking charity status thing, it's like unnecessarily kind of complicating the issue, because in a sense, some of the critics of this policy are right in that this is not going to affect the super, super wealthy who will always be able to pay fees no matter what. It is more likely to affect the odd lower middle class kid that managed to get in. It is more likely it's not going to really shake the fundamental problem that we have with private schools, which is that it reproduces the class system. Let's just cut the crap and just abolish them, because there's no actual justification for keeping this ridiculous system going other than preserving the leg up that a certain segment of this society has over the rest of us.
I'm just thinking more about the, Nick Ferrari declaring his interests, because I assume when he was sort of saying that, he was thinking like, look, I'm being an honest, transparent journalist. I'm saying I do have a stake in this conversation because my parents sent me to private school and I've sent my kids to private school. But I'm just thinking that disclaimer should actually be in front of way more conversations. Like, anytime Nick Ferrari talks about austerity on LBC, he should have to do a disclaimer. Oh, by the way, actually, I don't have much of a stake in public services because my kids go to private school and I went to private school. Now, anytime he talks about a teacher's strike, he should say, well, to be honest, I don't really understand what's going on here at all because my kids went to private school and I went to private school. Why is it only when he's specifically defending private schools does he have to give that disclaimer? Because the whole point of, as you said quite articulately there, private schools, they are about sort of this positional good where you say, I want an advantage over the rest of society. But they're also saying, I can opt out of public services. I don't really care if school budgets have been squeezed over the past 12 years as they have been, because that doesn't affect my kids. So many MPs legislating on the budgets that go to the schools that 93% of the population go to, when it has no impact whatsoever on their kids because they've opted out. It's like as if we had, if 7% of the population got their cancer treatment private, and then you've got all these Tory MPs voting to squeeze the funding of the NHS, that would be a scandal. It should be. And here we sort of accept it.